There was once a world long forgotten, a world that existed before kings ruled nations, before empires rose from dust, before history had names. People lived, people loved, children ran through villages, families gathered to eat, men worked, women dreamed of tomorrow. Life moved as it always had, ordinary, predictable, safe. And perhaps that was exactly why no one saw the end coming. Because history has always been cruel in one particular way. Disaster rarely announces itself. Civilizations do not wake up one morning believing they are living through their final days. People continue laughing, trading, planning tomorrow. Ask if tomorrow belongs to them. And maybe that is exactly what happened then. The sky still stood above them. The rivers still flowed. The land still gave food. Everything seemed normal. Until somewhere among them, one man began to act strangely. His name was Noah, not a king, not a conqueror, not a man of wealth. Simply Noah. And while the world around him continued living without fear, Noah began building something impossible. A giant wooden vessel, piece by piece, day after day, month after month, year after year. No ocean nearby, no storm approaching, no reason anyone could understand. Imagine seeing him, an old man building something absurd in open land. People must have laughed. They must have whispered. Perhaps children mocked him as they passed. Perhaps neighbors shook their heads. Poor Noah. He has lost his mind. Because warnings always sound foolish, until the moment they become true. And Noah kept building, while the world celebrated. He prepared. While people ignored danger, he listened. While humanity believed tomorrow would never change, Noah quietly built survival. But survival from what? That was the question no one asked seriously. Until one day, something changed. Perhaps it began with silence. Or perhaps the sky darkened in a way no one expected. Maybe the wind carried something unfamiliar. A feeling, a warning. The kind people ignore because fear feels inconvenient. After all, human beings have always believed the same dangerous lie. Nothing bad will happen to us. And then, the rain came. At first, perhaps people were not afraid. Rain was normal. Rain fed the earth. Rain gave life. But this rain was different, because it did not stop. Hour after hour, day after day, the rivers began to swell. Roads disappeared. Homes collapsed. Fear spread. And suddenly, the same people who once laughed stopped laughing. Panic replaced certainty. People ran. Families screamed. Mothers held children close. Men searched desperately for safety. But the water kept rising, higher and higher. Villages vanished. Fields disappeared. Entire communities swallowed without mercy. The world they trusted was disappearing, and somewhere in the distance stood the Ark, the impossible thing Noah had spent years building, the thing everyone mocked, the thing no one believed they would need. And perhaps that is the cruelest truth of all. The things that save us are often the things we ignore first. For thousands of years, people have called this story impossible. A myth, a fantasy, a religious legend, a tale too unbelievable to be real. And maybe they are right. Maybe humanity remembers something it cannot fully explain. Because here is where the mystery begins. Noah's story is not the only flood story. Ancient civilizations separated by oceans. People who never knew each other somehow told the same terrifying tale. A flood, a chosen survivor, humanity nearly erased. How could that be? Coincidence? Shared imagination? Or memory? Could there have once been a catastrophe so devastating that survivors carried its memory across generations, until history itself forgot where the story began. And if Noah's world truly vanished beneath the water, then another question becomes impossible to ignore. What destroyed them? The flood. The arrogance of believing disaster could never come. Because if there is one thing history has taught us, it is this: civilizations often collapse long before they realize they are falling. And perhaps that is why Noah's story still refuses to die. Not because of an ark, not because of animals, but because deep down, every generation fears the same question. Could it happen again? Before we answer whether Noah was real, before we decide whether this was history or myth, we must go back to the forgotten world before the flood, back to a civilization standing at the edge of destruction, without even knowing it. Because every ending always begins with a story. Before we can understand Noah, before we can understand the flood, we must first understand the world that came before it. Because every catastrophe always begins long before disaster arrives. And according to the ancient story, the flood was not the beginning. It was the ending of a world, a forgotten world, a world buried beneath time, a civilization humanity may no longer remember. The truth is, when most people imagine the ancient past, they imagine simplicity. Small tribes, primitive tools, scattered families trying to survive. But history tells us something surprising. Even thousands of years ago, human beings were already building civilizations, already organizing societies, already struggling with power, wealth, violence, and ambition. And if Noah truly lived in a historical setting, many scholars believe his world may have existed somewhere near one of the oldest regions of civilization on Earth, ancient Mesopotamia, the land between two mighty rivers, the Tigris and the Euphrates, a place historians often call the cradle of civilization. This was not empty wilderness. Far from it. This was a world of farmers, builders, merchants, priests, families learning how to transform chaos into order. Here, humanity learned to plant crops, to build homes, to trade goods, to establish laws. The first cities began rising from the earth, and for the first time in history, human beings stopped wandering. They settled, they built, they dreamed of permanence. Imagine standing there, fields stretching into the distance, smoke rising from homes, animals grazing nearby, the sounds of labor echoing through villages, children laughing, markets alive with conversation, life moving forward. It would have looked, in many ways, like the beginning of everything. But every civilization hides its weakness, and Mesopotamia had one terrifying weakness: water. The same rivers that fed life could also destroy it. The Tigris and Euphrates were unpredictable, violent. Without warning, floodwaters could rise and swallow entire settlements. Fields vanished overnight. Homes collapsed. Families disappeared. To ancient people, these floods were not merely natural disasters. They felt like punishment, wrath, judgment, the sky itself turning against mankind. And perhaps this is where the story of Noah begins to feel less impossible. Because imagine for a moment, you are living thousands of years ago. No weather forecasts, no satellites, no warning systems. One moment, life feels normal. The next, everything is gone. A flood large enough to destroy an entire region would feel like the end of the world itself. Especially if your world was small. Especially if the horizon of your life ended at distant hills. To ancient people, a regional catastrophe may have looked like the destruction of all humanity. And this is where the mystery deepens. Because Noah's flood story, it is not alone. Long before the Bible was written, Another civilization told a remarkably similar story. The people of Mesopotamia preserved an ancient epic, one of the oldest stories ever discovered by mankind. A story carved into clay tablets, hidden beneath ruins for thousands of years. A story now known as the Epic of Gilgamesh. And inside that story, there is a man named Utnapishtim, a survivor, a man warned of a coming flood, a man instructed to build a giant vessel, a man told to preserve life, animals, family, survival. The similarities are disturbing, too similar to ignore. One righteous man, a great flood, a boat, the destruction of civilization, a rebirth afterward. And suddenly, a dangerous question emerges. Did the writers of the Bible borrow an older story? Or were both stories remembering something real? A catastrophe so traumatic that it survived through memory, passed from parent to child, generation after generation, until myth and history became impossible to separate. And it does not end there, because flood stories appear everywhere. In ancient Greece, there was Deucalion, a man who survived a divine flood. In Hindu tradition, there was Manu, warned of a coming destruction, saved upon a vessel. In Chinese legends, great floods nearly destroyed civilization. Even among isolated indigenous tribes, stories survived of waters swallowing the earth. Different continents, different languages, different gods, and yet the same haunting memory. Why? How could people separated by oceans remember the same fear? Could ancient humanity have experienced some forgotten environmental catastrophe? Some massive flooding event, a rising sea, a disaster so enormous that survivors scattered across the world carrying fragments of memory. Historians have debated this question for decades, and while no consensus exists, some theories are fascinating. One theory points toward the end of the last ice age, thousands of years ago. Massive glaciers began melting. Sea levels rose dramatically. Entire coastlines disappeared. Places where humans once lived, now buried beneath water. Imagine villages swallowed by rising seas, communities forced to flee, generations growing up hearing stories of lands that no longer existed, stories turning into legends, legends turning into sacred truth. Could Noah's flood be an echo of that memory? No one truly knows, but there is another layer to Noah's story, one often ignored, because according to the biblical account, the problem was not merely environmental. The problem was human. Genesis describes a world becoming morally corrupted, violence spreading everywhere, cruelty increasing, power becoming dangerous, the strong dominating the weak, a civilization losing its sense of right and wrong. The text paints a troubling picture, not simply of sinners, but of societal collapse. A people forgetting morality, forgetting restraint, forgetting compassion. And when societies lose morality, history shows us something terrifying. Collapse eventually follows. Look at the great empires. Rome, Babylon. Kingdoms once believed eternal, powerful, untouchable. Yet every civilization, without exception, eventually weakened from within. Greed, division, violence, corruption. History repeats the same lesson again and again. Perhaps that is why Noah's story continues to matter. Because maybe, just maybe, the flood was never only about water. Maybe the flood was the final consequence of a broken civilization. And suddenly, the story begins to feel uncomfortably modern, because when we look around today, what do we see? Political division, greed, distrust, violence normalized, people chasing power, truth becoming harder to recognize, entire societies growing, anxious, disconnected, lonely, exhausted. Technology advancing faster than wisdom. And if history teaches anything, it is this: no civilization collapses overnight. Collapse happens slowly, quietly, almost invisibly, until one day, people look around and realize something precious has already been lost. Perhaps Noah's generation felt the same way. Perhaps they ignored the warning signs. Perhaps they believed, like all civilizations do, that tomorrow would always arrive, until suddenly, it did not. And this raises another haunting question. If Noah stood among us today, would we listen? Or would we laugh at him too? Would we dismiss him as paranoid, old-fashioned, fearful? Because history has never been kind to people who warn others too early. Most prophets are mocked, most visionaries ignored, most warnings dismissed, until the consequences become impossible to escape. But before we decide whether Noah was hero, myth, or memory, we must understand the man himself. Who was Noah? Why was he chosen? And what kind of person spends years preparing for a disaster no one else believes is coming? Because somewhere in this forgotten world, while humanity continued living without fear, one man quietly began building something impossible. Something history would never forget: the Ark. And perhaps, without even realizing it, humanity's future was already being built board by board. There are moments in history, or perhaps moments in legend, when everything changes because one person chooses to listen, while everyone else refuses to hear. Noah's story begins there. Not with the flood, not with the ark, but with silence. A quiet man, living in a loud world. The ancient text tells us very little about Noah. No grand speeches, no dramatic rise to power, no army, no throne. Only one strange sentence that somehow survived thousands of years. Noah was righteous in his generation. And perhaps that single sentence tells us more than we realize. Because righteousness becomes most visible in a corrupt world. You do not notice honesty among honest people. You notice honesty when deception surrounds it. You notice kindness when cruelty becomes normal. You notice integrity when everyone else compromises. And according to the ancient account, Noah lived in such a world. Violence had become ordinary. Greed had become admired. Power belonged to those willing to take it. Compassion grew weak. Truth became negotiable. Humanity continued building, while slowly destroying itself. And somewhere among them was Noah. Perhaps he looked ordinary. Perhaps if you passed him in the marketplace, you would never notice him. A husband, a father, a worker. Someone people trusted. Someone predictable. Quiet men rarely attract attention. Until suddenly, they do something impossible. No one knows exactly when the warning came. The story simply tells us God spoke to Noah. A warning, a coming destruction. A flood unlike anything humanity had ever seen. And then, impossible command. Build an ark. Imagine hearing those words. Build something no one understands. Prepare for a disaster no one believes in. Spend years of your life preparing for something invisible. No proof, no evidence, no crowd supporting you. Only uncertainty, only faith. Most people would refuse. Most people would hesitate. Some would wait for confirmation. Others would ask for certainty. But Noah, according to the story, began building. And perhaps that is the first mystery of Noah. Not the flood, not the miracle, but obedience. How does someone continue moving forward when the entire world thinks they are wrong? Imagine the first day. Wood stacked nearby. Open land stretching before him. A vision no one else could see. His son standing beside him. Confused perhaps, uncertain, but helping anyway. Neighbors passing by, watching, curious at first. Maybe people simply wondered, what is Noah building? But curiosity always turns into mockery when people fail to understand something. Days became months. Months became years, and the structure kept growing. Larger, stranger, impossible to ignore. A giant vessel standing where no sea existed. And suddenly, Noah became a joke. People laughed. How could they not? Imagine the conversations. Men gathered after work, laughing over food, shaking their heads. Noah says the sky will destroy us. A flood. The old man has lost his mind. Children pointing as they walked by. Merchants whispering. Friends distancing themselves. Perhaps even relatives questioned him. Why are you wasting your life? What are you afraid of? Nothing is happening. And maybe that was the hardest part. Not building the ark, but building it while being misunderstood. Because ridicule has always been one of humanity's sharpest weapons. People laugh at what threatens their comfort. People mock what challenges normality. Warnings make people uncomfortable, especially when those warnings demand change. And Noah's very existence became uncomfortable. Because if Noah was right, everyone else was wrong. And people rarely forgive the possibility of being wrong. Still, he kept building, morning after morning, hammer striking wood, hands tired, years passing, the ark slowly rising into the sky. Imagine the loneliness. Imagine doubting yourself. Even faithful people doubt. Even courageous people fear. Perhaps Noah stood alone some nights, looking at the stars, wondering, did I truly hear correctly? What if I am wrong? What if everyone else is right? Because faith, real faith, does not exist without uncertainty. Faith without doubt is certainty, and certainty requires no courage. But Noah continued, and while he built, the world kept moving. Weddings continued. Children were born. Markets stayed busy. People celebrated. Life carried on as if tomorrow belonged to them forever. And is not that always the way? Human beings are experts at ignoring danger. History proves it. Warnings arrive, and people dismiss them. Scientists warn. Leaders warn. Visionaries warn. But most people continue living exactly as before. Because fear feels inconvenient. Preparation feels unnecessary. Until reality arrives. And according to the story, reality finally arrived. The day began like every other day. No one expected history to end. No one woke up believing civilization stood at the edge of destruction. Perhaps children still laughed that morning. Perhaps merchants still opened their stalls. Perhaps families still planned for next week. And then, the sky changed. Clouds gathered. Strange, heavy, unnatural. Wind moved differently. Animals behaved strangely. The air itself felt uneasy. People looked upward, confused, uncomfortable. Then, rain. At first, ordinary, nothing alarming. Rain was familiar. Rain meant life, crops, hope. But this rain did not stop. Hour after hour, the rivers swelled, roads vanished, homes flooded. Panic slowly replaced confidence. Still, many probably believed it would end. Storms always end. Floods recede. Tomorrow always comes. Except this time, tomorrow never arrived. The waters kept rising. Faster, relentless, merciless. Villages disappeared beneath rushing currents. Fields vanished. Animals fled. Families screamed. People ran toward higher ground. Desperation replaced pride. Fear replaced certainty. And somewhere, Through sheets of endless rain stood the Ark, the thing everyone mocked, the impossible thing, the foolish thing, the unnecessary thing. Suddenly, it no longer looked foolish. Suddenly, it looked like survival. And perhaps that moment, that terrible realization, was worse than the flood itself. The moment people understood Noah had been right. But by then, time had already run out. The ancient story tells us Noah entered the ark with his family, his wife, his sons, their wives, and animals. 2 by 2. Life preserved, a fragile hope floating against destruction. Outside, the world disappeared. Water swallowed roads, villages, fields, memories. Civilization itself fading beneath rising waves. Can you imagine the silence? No voices, no marketplaces, no songs, only endless water stretching in every direction. A world erased, or at least, a world transformed forever. And somewhere upon that endless emptiness floated Noah, a man who had spent years preparing for a future no one believed would arrive, perhaps exhausted, perhaps grieving, because survival carries its own sadness. To survive disaster often means watching everything familiar disappear. And maybe that is the forgotten part of Noah's story. People talk about the ark, the miracle, the animals, but rarely the loneliness, the sorrow, the unbearable silence after loss. Imagine standing upon that ark, knowing everyone you once knew was gone, the world you understood, gone, the life you built, gone, only uncertainty ahead, only water, only waiting. Days passed, then weeks, then months. Nothing but horizon, nothing but patience. Until finally, one day, the waters began to retreat. Land slowly returned. Hope returned. The future returned. And humanity, according to the story, began again from one family, one ark. One impossible act of preparation. But here is the question that still echoes through history. Was Noah merely lucky? Was he chosen? Or was Noah simply the only person willing to prepare, while everyone else laughed? Because perhaps that is the real reason humanity still remembers him. Not because he built a boat, but because when the world ignored danger, he paid attention. And history has always remembered the people who prepare before the storm arrives. Now, we arrive at the question that has divided historians, scientists, theologians, and ordinary people for centuries. Did Noah's flood really happen? Was there truly a moment in human history when water swallowed civilization? Did a man named Noah actually survive aboard an ark? Or has humanity simply been telling itself the same story for thousands of years? The truth is, this is where certainty disappears. Because Noah's flood sits in a strange place between history, memory, myth, and faith. Some people believe the answer is simple. They believe the flood happened exactly as written. A global catastrophe. A world submerged beneath water. A divine judgment. Others dismiss it completely. A fictional story. And ancient metaphor. Nothing more than mythology. But the deeper you look, the stranger the mystery becomes. Because while historians disagree about Noah, almost everyone agrees on one thing. Human civilizations across the world remembered something, and that something is difficult to ignore. Let us begin with the evidence. Or perhaps with the clues, because Noah's story does not stand alone. Thousands of years ago, long before modern religion, ancient civilizations were already telling flood stories. And what makes this unsettling is how similar they are. In ancient Mesopotamia, there was a survivor named Utnapishtim. The story appears in one of the oldest literary works humanity has ever discovered, the Epic of Gilgamesh, a text older than much of the Hebrew Bible. In that story, the gods decide humanity has become corrupt. A flood is coming. One man is warned. He builds a great vessel. He saves animals. He survives destruction. And afterward, the world begins again. Sound familiar? Too familiar. And suddenly, historians ask a dangerous question. Did the Noah story borrow from older myths? Or did multiple civilizations remember the same forgotten catastrophe? Because Mesopotamia was not alone. Ancient Greece told of Deucalion, a righteous survivor warned before a flood. In India, ancient texts speak of Manu, In Chinese tradition, stories survived of devastating floods threatening civilization, even cultures separated by oceans, with no known contact, carried similar memories: water, judgment, survival, rebirth. Why? How could people so separated by geography remember almost the same nightmare? Coincidence seems too simple, yet certainty remains impossible. And so, historians developed theories. The first theory is the one most people know. Theory 1, the global flood. This theory accepts the biblical account literally. The entire earth flooded, mountains submerged, humanity destroyed, Noah and the Ark surviving alone. Many believers still hold this interpretation, and for them, the story requires no scientific approval. Faith itself is enough. But from a historical perspective, this theory faces enormous challenges. Because geology tells us stories too. Scientists examine sediment, layers, rock formations, fossils, and according to mainstream science, there is no clear evidence of a recent worldwide flood covering the entire planet. No universal flood layer. No sign that every mountain stood underwater within human civilization. And then there are practical questions. Questions critics often ask. How could every species fit onto one ark? How were ecosystems rebuilt afterward? Where did all the water come from? Where did it go? These questions remain deeply debated. For skeptics, this theory becomes difficult to defend scientifically. But what if? The story was never global. What if humanity misunderstood the scale? That leads us to theory 2, and perhaps the most fascinating possibility of all. Theory 2, the Great Regional Catastrophe. This theory suggests Noah's flood may have been real, but regional, not worldwide. Still devastating, still catastrophic, still unforgettable. Ancient Mesopotamia experienced violent flooding. The Tigris and Euphrates rivers could become merciless. Entire settlements vanished. Communities disappeared beneath mud and water. Archaeologists have even discovered flood deposits buried beneath ancient cities. Layers of sediment, evidence that catastrophic flooding once occurred. Now imagine this. You live 5,000 years ago. No maps, no satellites, no understanding of continents. Your entire world exists within the land you know. Then suddenly, everything disappears beneath water. Villages gone, fields destroyed, neighbors vanished. To you, that is not a regional flood. That is the end of the world. And perhaps this is where Noah's story begins to feel less impossible. Because memory changes over time. Survivors tell children, children tell grandchildren, Stories grow. Details become sacred. History transforms into meaning. And slowly, catastrophe becomes legend. A flood becomes the flood. A survivor becomes Noah. A memory becomes scripture. And honestly, there is something deeply human about that, because humans do not merely remember disasters. We turn them into warnings. We preserve them. We tell stories so future generations will not forget. But there is another theory, and this one may be the most uncomfortable of all. Theory 3. Noah was never about water. What if the flood was symbolic? What if Noah's story was never intended to describe geography, but morality? Think about it. In the biblical account, the flood begins after society collapses morally. Violence spreads. Corruption spreads. Human beings lose restraint. Truth disappears. Power becomes dangerous. The flood arrives, not because of weather, but because civilization breaks itself. Suddenly, the story feels strangely modern, because maybe Noah was never warning humanity about rain. Maybe Noah was warning humanity about itself. History teaches us something terrifying. Civilizations rarely die from one disaster. They weaken first, internally, morally, socially. Look at Rome, powerful beyond imagination. Yet, corruption spread, division deepened, trust collapsed. Eventually, Rome did not fall in one day. It slowly stopped being Rome. Could Noah's world have suffered the same fate? Could the flood simply symbolize collapse? Civilization drowning in its own corruption. It is uncomfortable to think about, because perhaps that makes Noah's story more relevant today than ever before. And now, allow me to share something personal, not as absolute truth, not as certainty, only as interpretation. If you ask me, someone fascinated by history, which explanation feels most compelling? I believe Noah's story may contain pieces of all three. I do not believe a worldwide flood covered the earth exactly as described. History and science struggle to support that idea. But I also do not believe the story emerged from nothing. Too many cultures remembered floods. Too many similarities survive. Too many ancient fears echo through time. I believe something catastrophic likely happened. A massive regional flood. A trauma so devastating that it permanently scarred collective memory. And over centuries, that memory became sacred. Noah, in this interpretation, becomes more than one man. He becomes humanity's symbol of survival. The person who listened, while everyone else ignored danger. The person who prepared, while others laughed. And maybe that is why the story still survives. Because every generation sees itself in Noah, or worse, in the people who mocked him. Because here is the frightening question we rarely ask. If catastrophe were approaching our world right now, would we recognize it? Or would we dismiss the warning? Climate change, political division, social collapse, mental exhaustion, economic fragility, environmental instability, technology growing faster than wisdom. Are these warning signs, or are we simply afraid? History has a cruel pattern. People ignore warnings until consequences become impossible to escape. Noah's generation, if the story is true, ignored the impossible until it became unavoidable. And perhaps that is why humanity keeps retelling this ancient mystery. Not because we are obsessed with the past, but because deep down, we fear the future. So, did Noah's flood really happen? The honest answer is this: no one knows. Not completely. Not with certainty. Perhaps it was history. Perhaps it was myth. Perhaps it was memory wrapped in faith. But maybe the better question is not, did the flood happen? Maybe the better question is, why has humanity refused to forget it? Because stories only survive thousands of years, when something inside them still feels true. And Noah's story, for reasons we still do not fully understand, continues haunting humanity. As though somewhere deep inside us, we suspect the warning was never only about the past. Now, let us step away from the ancient world for a moment. Forget the ark, forget the rain, forget the flood, and ask a far more uncomfortable question. What if Noah's story was never only about Noah? What if, for thousands of years, humanity kept retelling this story because deep down, we recognized ourselves in it? Because when we hear about ancient civilizations collapsing, something inside us quietly whispers, that could never happen to us. And yet, history has heard those words before, many times. The Egyptians believed their greatness would endure forever. The Romans believed their empire was eternal. Babylon believed its walls made it untouchable. Every civilization that ever collapsed once believed collapse was impossible. And perhaps that is the first disturbing similarity between Noah's world and ours, the belief that we are too advanced to fail. Look around us. We live in an age humanity once could never imagine. We speak across continents instantly. Machines think. Medicine saves lives that once would have been lost. Technology has connected billions of people. We carry more knowledge in our pockets than ancient kings possessed in entire kingdoms. By every measure, human civilization has progressed. And yet, something feels fragile, does not it? People are more connected than ever. Yet loneliness grows. We have more information, yet trust feels weaker. We consume endlessly, yet satisfaction feels harder to find. The modern world moves faster every year. Faster conversations, faster outrage, faster change, faster exhaustion. And perhaps, without noticing, we have become a civilization permanently distracted, always scrolling, always consuming, always reacting, rarely pausing, rarely asking, where exactly are we heading? Because perhaps that was Noah's generation too, busy, distracted, certain tomorrow would look exactly like today. And is not that how danger always works? Rarely dramatic at first, rarely obvious. Collapse often arrives quietly. A little compromise here, a little corruption there, one ignored warning, one broken institution, one forgotten value. Until eventually, people wake up and wonder, when did everything begin to feel different? The truth is, human civilizations rarely collapse from one event. They weaken first, slowly, internally. And if Noah's story teaches anything, perhaps it is this. Disaster often begins long before anyone notices it. Let us speak honestly. Modern society is not perfect. We know this. Political division grows deeper every year. Entire societies struggle to agree on basic truth. Anger spreads faster than understanding. Churaj becomes entertainment. People shout. Few listen. Trust in institutions weakens. Families divide over beliefs. Communities feel fractured. Sometimes it feels as though the world has forgotten how to speak to itself. And then there is greed. The ancient story of Noah speaks of corruption, a society losing moral direction. And if we are honest, that concern feels strangely familiar. How often is success measured only by money? How often do people sacrifice integrity for power? How often are kindness and patience mistaken for weakness? We celebrate achievement, but sometimes forget character. We admire wealth, but rarely ask how it was gained. And somewhere along the way, many people quietly began asking themselves, why does progress feel so empty? Perhaps because material success cannot solve spiritual hunger. Ancient civilizations learned this lesson painfully. History shows us something fascinating. Societies often collapse not when they become weak, but when they become comfortable. When comfort turns into arrogance, when abundance turns into excess, when success creates the illusion of invincibility. Rome expanded, wealth increased, entertainment flourished, luxury grew. Yet beneath the surface, division deepened, corruption spread, meaning weakened. Eventually, Rome did not fall because enemies became stronger. Rome weakened because Rome changed. And perhaps that is what makes Noah's story unsettling. Because maybe the flood itself is not the central warning. Maybe the warning is what happened before the flood. A society drifting. People ignoring deeper problems. Everyone assuming someone else will fix things. Someone else will worry. Someone else will prepare. Until suddenly, there is no time left. But let us move beyond politics. Because there is another modern parallel. One perhaps even more personal. Mental exhaustion. Look around. People are tired. Not physically. Emotionally. Spiritually. Psychologically. Anxiety rises. Depression spreads. Attention spans shrink. Many people wake up already exhausted. Not because life is impossible, but because modern life never pauses. We live surrounded by noise. Notifications, breaking news, arguments, pressure, comparison, expectations. People once feared starvation. Now many fear meaninglessness. And maybe this too echoes Noah's world, a civilization busy surviving while forgetting how to truly live. Then there is the environment, and whether one agrees or disagrees on climate debates, one reality remains undeniable. Humanity increasingly worries about instability, rising temperatures, extreme weather, flooding, drought, environmental disruption. For some, this feels eerily symbolic. Another generation debating warning signs, another generation uncertain whether danger is real, another generation divided between caution and skepticism. And suddenly, the Noah story feels strangely modern again, because at its heart, Noah's story is about warning, not certainty. Warning, a possibility, a chance to prepare, a voice saying, perhaps we should pay attention. But humans rarely enjoy warnings. Warnings demand sacrifice. Warnings interrupt comfort. Warnings force difficult conversations. And history shows most people resist uncomfortable truths until those truths become unavoidable. Think about every major crisis in history. Financial crashes, wars, environmental disasters, pandemics. Afterward, people often say the same thing. The signs were there. We just did not see them. Or perhaps, more honestly, they were there, and people simply did not want to look. And maybe that is why Noah's story survived, because it reflects something deeply human, the tendency to ignore uncomfortable possibilities, the belief that disaster belongs to someone else, another country, another generation, another civilization. Never ours, never now. But perhaps the deepest lesson of Noah's story is not fear. It is responsibility, because Noah did not control the storm. He only controlled his preparation. He did not waste time arguing endlessly. He acted quietly, patiently, faithfully, while others laughed. And perhaps that is the real question Noah leaves us with today. Not, will disaster come? History guarantees challenges always come. The question is, how will we respond before they arrive? Will we ignore warning signs, mock preparation, dismiss caution? Or will we become wise enough to prepare before panic begins? because wisdom has always looked strange to people who feel safe. Preparation often appears foolish until the moment it becomes necessary. And perhaps, somewhere in this ancient story, humanity left itself a reminder. Not about punishment, not about fear, but about responsibility, about humility, about remembering that civilizations, like people, are rare, more fragile than they appear. And if history has taught us anything, it is this: the greatest danger is not disaster itself. The greatest danger is believing disaster could never happen. So now, before we leave Noah behind, there is one final thing we must ask. If his story still survives after thousands of years, if civilizations refuse to let it disappear, then perhaps there is still something humanity has not yet learned. Because maybe, just maybe, Noah was never warning the ancient world alone. Maybe he was warning us too. And so, after thousands of years, we arrive at the end of Noah's story. Or perhaps not the end. Perhaps what survived the flood was never merely a story, but a warning. A warning carried across generations, protected by memory, preserved by fear, repeated because humanity sensed something inside it still mattered. Whether you believe Noah was real, whether you see him as history, myth, symbol, or sacred truth, one fact remains impossible to ignore. People refuse to forget him. Thousands of years have passed. Empires rose and collapsed. Languages disappeared. Entire civilizations vanished. And still, Noah remains. Why? Why did this story survive when countless others disappeared? Because stories only survive when they continue speaking to something deeply human. And Noah's story speaks to fear, hope, responsibility, collapse, and perhaps above all, choice. Because at its core, Noah's story has always been about choices. A world making dangerous choices. A civilization ignoring warning signs. People believing consequences belonged to someone else. And one man making a different choice. The choice to prepare. The choice to listen. The choice to act even when nobody understood. And, perhaps, that alone is why humanity still remembers him. Because every generation eventually faces the same uncomfortable reality. Life changes. Crisis comes. Nothing stays permanent forever. History teaches us this lesson repeatedly. Kingdoms fall. Economies collapse. Wars begin unexpectedly. Natural disasters arrive without permission. Pandemics spread. Communities break. Lives change overnight. Human beings crave certainty, yet history offers none. And perhaps that is why Noah feels strangely timeless. Because Noah represents something rare. Preparation in an age of denial. Courage in an age of mockery. Faith in an age of uncertainty. The truth is, most people only prepare after consequences arrive. People save money after financial collapse. People care for health after sickness appears. People value relationships after loss. People search for meaning after suffering. But Noah, if the story is true, prepared before disaster. And maybe that is the first lesson humanity still struggles to learn. Lesson 1. Prepare before the storm comes. The storm always comes. Not always as water. Not always as catastrophe. Sometimes the storm looks different. A broken relationship, financial hardship, loss, illness, failure, mental exhaustion, unexpected change. Life eventually tests everyone. And when those moments arrive, preparation matters. Emotionally, mentally, spiritually. The strongest people are not those who never struggle. The strongest people are those who quietly prepare before struggle begins. Noah built before rain. Most people wait for rain before building. And history repeatedly asks, which kind of person are you becoming? The person who prepares, the person who waits. But Noah teaches another difficult lesson too. Because perhaps the hardest part of his journey was not the ark itself. Perhaps the hardest part was loneliness. Lesson 2. Doing the right thing often feels lonely. Imagine Noah again. Years of building, years of ridicule, years of misunderstanding. Everyone around him laughing, questioning him, ignoring him, and still, he continued. This may be one of the most painful truths of life. Doing what is right often feels lonely at first. Integrity feels lonely. Discipline feels lonely. Patience feels lonely. Growth feels lonely. People rarely applaud difficult decisions in the beginning. In fact, they often criticize them because change makes people uncomfortable. Preparation reminds others of what they are avoiding. And perhaps some of you watching understand that feeling. Trying to improve yourself while others mock ambition. Trying to protect your peace while others chase chaos. Trying to choose patience in an angry world. Trying to stay honest in systems rewarding dishonesty. Noah reminds us, you do not need the crowd's approval to walk the right path. Sometimes, wisdom looks foolish before it looks wise, and history has always been slow to recognize people ahead of their time. But there is another warning hidden inside Noah's story. One humanity repeatedly ignores. Lesson 3. Arrogance is the beginning of collapse. If Noah's story contains historical truth, then perhaps the flood did not begin with rain. Perhaps it began with pride, because civilizations become dangerous when they believe we are untouchable. We are too advanced. Nothing can stop us. History punishes arrogance every time. Egypt believed its power eternal. Babylon believed its walls unbreakable. Rome believed itself immortal. Yet eventually, every empire discovered the same painful truth. Nothing lasts forever. And perhaps this warning matters more today than ever. Modern civilization is extraordinary. But extraordinary does not mean invincible. Technology cannot eliminate human weakness. Wealth cannot eliminate suffering. Progress cannot eliminate consequences. And perhaps the greatest mistake humanity keeps repeating is confusing advancement with wisdom. We grow smarter, but are we growing wiser? We communicate faster, but do we understand each other more deeply? We build bigger systems, but are we building stronger character? Noah's story quietly asks us, what happens when power grows faster than morality? And perhaps that question matters more now than at any other point in history. But beneath all the warnings, Noah's story still leaves room for something beautiful. Hope. Because despite everything, despite destruction, despite fear, despite collapse, something survived. Life survived. Meaning survived. The future survived. Noah's Ark, whether literal or symbolic, represents hope carried through chaos. The belief that even after devastation, humanity can begin again. And perhaps that is the deepest lesson of all. Lesson 4. Even after collapse, renewal is possible. Life breaks people. History breaks civilizations. Mistakes happen. Loss comes. Sometimes everything falls apart. But endings are not always endings. Sometimes they become beginnings. The flood ended one world, but according to the story, it also began another. And maybe some people watching this need to hear that today. Your storm does not define you. Your mistakes do not define you. Your worst season is not the end of your story. Sometimes life destroys what no longer serves us, so something stronger can grow. And finally, perhaps the most uncomfortable lesson Noah leaves us with, Lesson 5. Warnings matter. Human beings are strange. We ignore warnings because they feel inconvenient. We postpone difficult conversations. We delay preparation. We assume there will always be more time, until suddenly there is not. And history whispers the same message again and again. The signs are usually visible before collapse. People just do not want to see them. Noah saw something others ignored. Whether through faith, wisdom, or intuition, he paid attention. And maybe, in our own lives, we should ask ourselves, what warning signs am I ignoring? In my relationships, in my health, in my purpose, in the kind of person I am becoming. Because perhaps Noah's story was never meant to scare humanity. Perhaps it was meant to wake humanity. And now, after thousands of years, the question remains, not whether Noah existed, not whether every detail happened exactly as written, but something much harder, something deeply personal. If Noah stood among us today, would we recognize him? Would we listen? Or would we laugh again? Would we dismiss the warning until consequences arrived? Because history has a frightening habit. Human beings often repeat the mistakes they believe could never happen twice. And maybe that is why Noah's story survived. Not because of the flood, not because of the ark, but because somewhere deep inside, humanity fears becoming the generation that ignored the warning. So now, the story ends with a question. One humanity has never fully answered, and perhaps never will. Was Noah a survivor of history, or the last warning humanity still refuses to understand? The answer may depend on what kind of world we choose to build next.